Si Dios fuera negro, mi compay, todo cambiaría. Fuera nuestra raza, mi compay, la que mandaría. Negro el presidente y el gobernador, negro el abogado y negro el doctor, compay. Si Dios fuera negro, mi compay, todo cambiaría. Fuera nuestra raza, mi compay, la que mandaría. Negra la azucena y negra la tiza, negra Blanca Nieve, negra Mona Lisa, compay. Si Dios fuera negro, mi compay, todo cambiaría. Fuera nuestra raza, mi compay, la que mandaría. Pim, pim, pum, pim, 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 pum, pim, 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 pum, pim, 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 pum, pim. Si Dios fuera negro, mi compay, todo cambiaría. Fuera nuestra raza, mi compay, la que mandaría. Negro fuera el día, negro fuera el sol, negra la mañana, negro el algodón, compay. Si Dios fuera negro, mi compay, todo cambiaría. Fuera nuestra raza, mi compay, la que mandaría. Negro fuera el papa y negro el ministro, los ángeles negros, negro Jesucristo, compay. Si Dios fuera negro, mi compay, todo cambiaría. Fuera nuestra raza, mi compay, la que mandaría.
Ñaño, vengo a buscar una goma porque estoy engomado.
Bueno, yo tengo unas gomas blancas ahí que las doy baratas. Ahora, si las quieres con vaina negra, te valen más cara.
Oye, Penín, ¿tú ves este tipo blanco que está aquí? Así blanco como tú lo ves. Tiene el corazón negro, buena gente. ¡Qué buena gente! Oye, ¿qué pasa, chico?
Nada, que acaba usted de comerse la línea negra.
Muchacho, tengo una hambre blanca, men.
Vamos a jugar un billar.
Pero, ¿y qué jugamos?
Bueno, vamos a jugar al 8 blanco con el mingo negro.
Welcome, everybody. We're so happy to see your face and to see you here tonight with us. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for this conversation. And before we begin, we want to let you know that in case you need transcription in another language that is not English, si hablas español, or Portuguese or French, the live transcription portion has been enabled, so you can go to the bottom where it says CC or live transcription, and that will transcribe what is being said in the language of your preference. And with that being said, again, we are so happy that you are joining us tonight in this sort of the first event of what we have come to know as the Afro-Latina Theology Project, or the ALTP by its by its small name. And we wanted to share with you the mission. The ALTP seeks to expand the narrative of Latine and Black theologies by centering the voices of Black Latinas within theological and religious spaces. We educate about the experiences of Black Latinidad by giving exposure to writings and stories that seek to diversify Hispanic/Latinx and Black theological and religious spaces. This project is guided by an anti-racist, anti-patriarchal, and anti-capitalist perspective, and it seeks to affirm all religious and theological expressions of Afro-Latinidad. And like I have said, we are overjoyed that you are joining us tonight and that you are going to be part of this, the first inaugural event, the first conversation of a series of 4 conversaciones, of 4 talks that we will have throughout the year. So if you want to continue to join us in these talks and continue to be in conversation with us and in community with us, you can follow us on our Instagram at Afro-Latina Theology, or you can go to the Facebook page at Afro-Latina Theology, or you can sign up for our newsletter in our website, which is www.afrolatinatheology.com. And with that being said, I want to give the space for what we have come tonight to do. And so I want to introduce Karla Mendoza, who is going to be our moderator tonight. Karla Mendoza uses she, her, ella pronouns and was born in Lima, Peru. And she's currently residing on the stolen lands of the Miami, Kickapoo, and Erie peoples in Northwest Ohio. Karla is a writer, a poet, an activist, a storyteller, a grassroots theologian, and an organic intellectual. Most of her work has been focused on the intersection of identity, faith, activism, and anti-racist discipleship. Currently, Karla is the host of El Cafecito with Karla, which is a podcast where she interviews her friends in organic conversation. And most of all, Karla loves to laugh, to dance, and to listen to Afro-Peruvian music, and to be a connector of peoples. And so, Karla, we are so happy that you are going to be with us tonight and are going to be guiding this conversation. So I'll leave the space to you so you can introduce our speaker for the night.
Thank you so much, Yolanda. Hi, everyone. I'm so glad you're here. I'm so excited for tonight. I have the honor of introducing our guest, and I also have the honor of hosting this conversation. So I will read her bio so you know a little bit about her. And then we'll get started. So Dr. Maldonado, thank you for being here. Dr. Maldonado earned her bachelor's degree from Georgetown University, her master's degree from Union Theology Seminary, and her PhD in systemic and philosophical theology from the Graduate Theological Union. Working primarily at the Jesuit School of Theology, her research and teaching interests include Latino, Latina, Latin American, and feminist theologies, as well as interdisciplinary work in Afro-Caribbean studies. She is the author of multiple books, including Sor Juana, Beauty and Justice in the Americas, from Orby's Books, 2003, Afro-Cuban Theology, Religion, Race, Culture, and Identity from University Press of Florida, 2006, Embracing Latina Spirituality, A Woman's Perspective, from St. Anthony Messenger Press, 2009, Shopping, Christian Explorations in Daily Living from Fortress, 2010, and Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, an Introduction to Monotheism, co-author with Amanda Sondi and William S. Green from Bloomsbury, 2020. Dr. Maldonado is a member of the Catholic Theological Society of America, the American Academy of Religion, and the Academy of Catholic Hispanic Theologians in the United States, mostly known as ACTIS. She is a past president of ACTIS and recently collaborated with the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, creating bilingual follow-up materials for the 5th National Encuentro of Hispanic Latino Ministry. Thank you so much for being here with us, Dr. Michelle. How are you doing?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh no, oh my goodness, it's such an honor. I have been reading your book in preparation, and every time I'm just like, wait, what? I've never, and it's just me highlighting. But another thing that I also noticed from your book is how seen I felt, even though I'm not Afro-Cuban. And so, yeah, that was just very valuable to me. Like there were so many notes that I was taking where I just kept thinking, oh, nobody's ever voiced this out loud for me before. So I'm very thankful for your work.
Oh, thank you so much.
No, of course. So we want to get this conversation started. As you know, this is a new project. It's our first year. This is our launch event. So I was curious, you wrote this book in 2006, or it released in 2006. And I'm just curious to know, how did you first connect with Afro-Cuban theologies or thought in religious studies? Yeah, I would just love to hear.
Sure. So, it really was when I was an undergraduate at Georgetown University. And so for me, it was interesting because the first sort of minoritized voice I read in theology was I took a course with Diana Hayes called Black Liberation Theology when I was an undergrad. And that sort of opened up this world to me, right? I was a theology minor, and I had been reading primarily men and Euro-American and European voices. And then her course exposed me not only to theology from the perspective of historically underrepresented populations, but also the connection between theology and social justice, right? And activism, and that connection in terms of the Christian churches in the African American community. And it's hard to describe, but the whole time I was in her class, I kept feeling like this reminds me of my culture, my background, and I couldn't put my finger on it, right? Because even today, and I don't know if we're going to get into this, we exist in this kind of black-white paradigm in the United States. And Latinos and Latinas, we kind of get lost in the middle somehow, right? Because we often use exclusively racialized categories to talk about individuals in this country, even though when you're talking about the Latinx, the Latino, the Latina, the Hispanic, whatever word you use, we're obviously extremely racially diverse. And so she then pointed me to the work of Latino and Latina theologians. And so I started reading sort of, the Virgil Elizondo, sort of like those groundbreaking voices. And when I was reading them, they kept talking about mestizaje and Our Lady of Guadalupe and like indigenous roots. And I'm like, no, like this isn't right. Like this doesn't fit into my understanding of Cuban culture and identity and religion. And so it was really that kind of being informed by both those strands of thought is really what led me to look at race, not only and Blackness and Latino and Latina theology, but also kind of challenge some of the categories that Latino and Latina theology and symbols were using as normative, which really were only exclusively for one demographic. Granted, the largest demographic, but it's still only one demographic.
Yeah, absolutely. I noticed one of the big things for me in reading your book is the way that you critique different theologies, which I'll be honest, from, I'm just starting out in theology and all of that, but to me, it just seems like such a scary task to critique theology, but the way that you do it is you have a chapter specifically on Latino, Latine, Latinx theology, and then you have another one on Black theology. And I would just love to hear what that was like in the process of writing that and coming to terms with the critique that you were making.
So I think, it was a couple of things. I mean, one is, it's scary to do that, and I was pretty fresh out of my PhD when I wrote that book. And so it wasn't like now, I'm not so fresh, but so it, I'm not going to lie, I don't think you take on sort of the ancestors in your kind of, and the abuelos y abuelas and sort of these theological giants and challenge their work without taking it very seriously. So one thing for me that was really important is to have, for lack of a better word, credibility, both among Black theologians and Latino and Latina theologians. So I was very engaged in conversations with those communities in places like the AAR and CTSA, trying to present in both of those spaces and really have dialogue partners, so that it wasn't just, you know, there's nothing to me more, I'll say the word upsetting when I read the work of someone that really isn't engaged in the dialogue, but just goes after people. Do you know what I mean? Or sort of says, you know, you're wrong and this and that. And so for me, it was really important to have that credibility and to say I'm someone that is very educated in this area and takes it very seriously, and I'm trying to dialogue with individuals. But the second, it wasn't, for me anyways, it wasn't coming from a place of critique. It was coming, I mean, it ended up a little bit that way, but it was coming from a place of creating a space for Afro, for Afro, my cat just decided to participate. It's okay, she's fine. It was about coming from a place to create a space for Afro-Caribbean peoples, you know, not only because I would say, I obviously focused on the Cuban, but to me, there was just a lack of sort of Caribeño presence at that historical moment. And I think that's changed now, but at that time, it wasn't just that Blackness was missing in Latino and Latina theology. It wasn't just that Cuba and the symbols and history and culture of Cuba was missing. I felt like the Caribbean as a whole was just very absent. And me being originally from Miami, born and raised there, it was so foreign to my understanding, my self-understanding of myself, but also my experience of the Latino and Latina community.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. So one in, you know, kind of in that vein, one of your chapters is specifically on mestizaje. As we have seen, even today, you know, people still use that word. So I would love to hear what you think about mestizaje now. How has the term changed since you first wrote about it? And how is mestizaje a form of erasure for Black Latina folks?
So I think that now we're much more nuanced in how we use it. So I think that's really important. So I think a lot of times we in the writing of and probably I did this too, to be honest with you, we would often use mestizaje not only to describe the content of mixture, so right, Indigenous and Spanish, sort of classically, but we'd also use it just to refer to mixture in general, right? And so it became sort of that marker for biracial, multiracial, multicultural, bicultural identity, both in Latin America and among Latinos and Latinas. And I think now scholars who are writing about it are much more nuanced and are saying this is exactly what we're referring to in this historical moment. You know, I'm not going to lie to you. I'm very cognizant of the critiques of mestizaje that highlight that it's a way to lighten the Latino and Latina community as a way of denying brownness and Blackness. You know, my husband's from Guatemala. I lived in where he's from. I lived for 2 years there in a Mayan community. There's a huge difference from being a Mayan in Guatemala and being a Latino, which would be someone who's mestizo. And so I think we still are not very good at talking about that and how that impacts not only in the global South, but impacts our populations here in the United States. So I still think there's a lot of work to do, but I do think we're getting better at it. But I also, I'm not going to lie, I think it becomes, I worry sometimes it's like how people use multicultural, you know, like, woo, it's happy, we're together, we're mixed, you know, like, I don't know, like, you know, or you know, it's a little bit too easy in some ways in terms of describing the complexity and the history that actually produced these populations, and also the disparities in terms of race, both in Latin America and the Caribbean, but also among Latinos and Latinas here in the US.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. So Thank you for that answer. Because I think that's true, is the idea of multiculturalism, where we're like, yes, it's all like happy-go-lucky, but
Yeah.
That hasn't always been the case. Another question that I have is, you ask in a chapter, are Afro-Latinos Black? Can you share some of your thoughts about Blackness in Latinidad?
Yes. So here I have to be honest with you. This is still something I struggle with. Blackness in this country, at least in the dominant discourse, and I would say not only the dominant discourse of the white community, but also in the dominant discourse of the Black community, refers to African American. And so it's something we struggle with. I think people like us, like you and me, that are trying to think about and write about these categories. I think it impacts, obviously, grassroots organizing. It erases certain experiences of Blackness. When I think about Blackness, and again, this is partially me being from the 305, I think about Haitian. I think about Cuban. I think about Bahamian. I mean, to me, Blackness does not equal African American. To me, African American is a cultural category in this country, and Blackness is a racial category, right? That encompasses many cultures and ethnicities across the U.S. But that's not how it's used, and even when folks are like, oh yeah, we know they're Latinos, they're brown people, they're Asian folks, we know, it's still, we automatically click back into that Black-white paradigm. And I don't know how to do it. Like it's something I think about a lot. How do we recognize the color line that has defined the history of this country and was resulted in the enslavement of individuals, and resulted in the torture, right, and kidnapping of men, women, and children based on this notion of Blackness, but also recognize our current historical moment. Do you know what I mean? Like, and so it's trying to be respectful of the history and also recognizing the function of race in this country, but also, like, I've been playing with the word erase in my mind a little bit, because obviously you can spell it. I mean, it's spelling it with a C instead of with an S, to think about what are ways that we erase each other in our discourses, and how can we find better language to speak about our communities and experiences without negating the historical experience of other communities.
Absolutely. I also would be curious, what are your thoughts on, specifically when it comes to the Latinx, Latino, Latine community and Blackness? What do you think in this moment in history, where do you think we are with that conversation?
It was interesting. In the last census, we had the highest percentage of Latinos and Latinas self-identify either as Black, as multiracial, which is good, right? It's sort of more of a recognition of the reality, I would say, of people's identity. But we still, as a community, overwhelmingly identify as white. And so it's still, for me, obviously whiteness equals privilege. And so if you can pass as white, right? So like, I'm in Scranton now. It was, not only is it, I always joke that not only is it the whitest place I've ever lived in, it actually makes me whiter because of the winter. And like the fact that, we're going to go, like, I don't see the sun for like 4 months out of the year. But it's one of those things that, we still have a lot of issues to deal with in terms of race, obviously, and colorism, I would say, within our communities. At the same time, we can't look at those in isolation, so I always struggle with, sometimes I'll talk about Latinos and Latinas as an ethnicity, right? But then if you use that word, you're erasing the racism. You know what I mean? That marks the experience of so many Latinos and Latinas. And also the desire for whiteness, that is overwhelmingly present in our community, right? And so, you know, I know some folks have talked about using the category of ethno-race, which is, you know, I've played around with a little bit in my writing, but we tend to live in a culture, and look, I'm a systematic theologian. We love categories. We love putting things in order. We love to make things simple, you know what I mean? And find easy language and easy ways to build bridges, but this isn't simple, right? And so it's hard because you want to recognize and acknowledge people's identity, but at the same time, people don't want the complicated answer. You know what I mean? They want like the soundbite about this.
Yeah.
And I also, you know, the last thing I would say, see, I'm not even giving sound bites, is I also think a lot about how our communities self-identify. You know what I mean? So, you know, a lot of us in the academy are very disconnected from how everyday people, the language they use, do you know what I mean? To say who they are, to self-identify, how they self-identify racially. Like, you know, Cubans have that horrible but very Cuban expression, "Y tu abuela dónde está?" Right? To talk about how Cubans want to mask race and mask Blackness in their backgrounds and in their histories. But at the same time, you know, if how can I put this? So my father self-identified as white. I'll use him as an example. And he was brown. He wasn't, my mother was white. She was blonde. She was very fair-skinned. But my father was brown and darker skinned, but he self-identified as white. And I'll never forget the first time I went, when I was at Union Theological Seminary doing my master's. The first time I went, I was going to like a woman of color conference. I helped organize it at Union. And actually Ada Maria Isasti Diaz spoke at it. It was the first time I met her in person. And I was like, I called my dad on the phone, landline back in the day, you know, because I would check in with my parents once a week. And, you know, I said, oh, I'm doing this woman of color conference. I'm really excited. I'm going to meet this theologian, that she's Cuban and blah, blah, blah. And I hung up, and like 5 minutes later, my dad called me back and he's like, wait a minute, you're white. Why are you organizing this conference? And I was like, no, I'm not white. I'm a person of color. And he's like, no, you're white. And I was like, well, you know, maybe we'll talk about this when I get home. You know, like, I don't want to get into this on the phone. But on one level, you want to say, look, there's the way we self-identify, and there's the way the world identifies us, right? And those aren't always in sync, and we have to be aware of that. But, you know, part of me, you know, as I'm older now, think, who am I to take my father's whiteness away from him? Do you know what I mean? Like, who am I to say you are not this race that he could have passed for? I mean, he was darker skinned, but, you know, could have been Italian, you know? I mean, it wasn't, you know, it wasn't Afro-Cuban. And so for me, I struggle with that as well. The ways that we somehow strip, in our writing, we often kind of strip and hide the ways that our communities self-identify, because it's not always the progressive, inclusive language that I think all of us wish was more normative.
Yeah, I absolutely, because I've been thinking so much about even the way we speak about the Latinx church in conversation, and it's always called the brown church. And I always think that's interesting, because I went to a Black Spanish speaking church, you know, right. So it was very much a Latino church, but we were not a brown church. We were a Black church, you know? And so I think about those terms and how people identify, and how language, as our friend Giuliani, who is on here, would say, how does el barrio say? How does el barrio identify, you know? So I think that's also an important part of the conversation. And I think, you know, one of the things we can't, unfortunately, avoid in this conversation is the anti-Blackness in the Latinx community. In communities, not even just in, you know, one, like we're multiples.
Yeah.
You know, it's very much real in our everyday lives, in academia, in church, in politics, you know. And so I would love to hear what you know, your thoughts on anti-Blackness in Latinidad.
I mean, it's definitely, obviously, we're not immune to it, right? We're not immune to racism. And in many ways, it's interesting, you know, to look at how, and I don't think anyone's really done this, how our views on race have shifted, you know, generationally. Do you know what I mean? From the folks that were maybe not born in the United States versus their children versus, do you know what I mean? These more recent generations, because I would imagine it's, depending on who we're talking about, we're having different conversations, right? I'm not saying that racism and anti-Blackness doesn't exist in across generations, but I think it is very different if we're talking about a different generation in this country versus sort of the younger folks. It's part of us falling into, at least here in, I mean, there are two ways to answer it. One is the categories we've inherited about race from our Latin American, from our homelands. Now, those categories are very different from the categories here in the US because there are more of them. Do you know what I mean? Like, whereas in the US, it's like one or the other, you know, Latin America had a much more complex racial hierarchy. And so it's interesting to think about, there's that, but then there's how we have bought into the Black-white paradigm. Right. And so, you know, people are like, well, I'm going to take the white side, you know, because that side is power and privilege and access. And so part of it is what we brought with us. And part of it is how being in this country makes it much sharper. Do you know what I mean? Because they're not the nuances that exist in many Latin American countries. Again, I'm not saying one's better than the other. But at the same time, when you're in a context where it's one or the other, becoming entrenched in whiteness, right, as identity. And also, I think, because we're talking about, you know, theology, we can't downplay the role of religion in this and how African religions have been demonized historically throughout the Caribbean and parts of Latin America, where you see a strong presence of Black communities. And that plays a role in it as well, frankly, because, you know, Christianity is associated with whiteness, with legitimacy. And then, you know, when we look at the field of religion, Blackness becomes not only not an alternative, right? So, you know, Hindus aren't demonized, but really the way that racism plays into how we understand African or African diaspora or Black Atlantic, whichever category you want to use, how you understand those religious traditions too is a really good case study at looking at how we, I would say demonize, I would use that word, Blackness in our cultures.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for, oh, were you going to say something else?
Well, I was going to say, you know, and it's just so complicated, right? So, you know, people say, well, we need more political power, right? The Latina community. Well, you know, unfortunately, we have Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio. We actually do have a lot of political power and voice. And it's very public. It's just not the voice, I suspect many people on the Zoom would like representing the Latina community. When you talk about, I mean, the leader of the Proud Boys, Enrique Tarrio, is an Afro-Cuban. No one talks about that, you know, and so it's also, it's messy, you know, and so, you know, if we're gonna talk about if we're gonna use Latinos and Latinos as a whole, as a collective, guess they're a part of it. You know what I mean? If we're gonna have a more nuanced understanding of the community, then that's a little bit different. But those are the folks I struggle with. You know what I mean? When I think about race and whiteness and power and privilege and think about how and representation, right? And that you don't always get what you want, so to speak, in terms of representing your community and voice.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's very true and very real.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, I know, right?
For sure. So not really changing the topic, but I would love to hear a little bit more about how in your book you write about popular religion. And so what might you say about the role of the Lukumi faith, or also known as Santeria, as part of that, or Afro-Cuban and Afro-Latino theology?
I mean, I can speak about, I probably would, obviously, thinking about Cuba as a case study, one of the things that is fascinating is to look at how religions like Santeria, Regla del Cha, for example, just have saturated Cuban culture, right? So whether it's the music, whether it's the art, whether it's the literature, you really see these religious beliefs and practices because, music and drumming is a religious practice in these religions, how they've become synonymous, right? With so many artistic expressions in Cuba, both obviously in literature and the arts and music. And to me, in the field of religion, you obviously see it in the presence of these religious traditions. But for me, and that's part of what I wanted to play with in the book, you see it in how it's marked Catholicism, right? So, whether it's the fact that La Caridad del Cobre, we have her because of a slave community, and their devotion to her for hundreds of years until really Cuba's independence wars, where she became a more national devotion. You have San Lázaro, who is the illegal saint, right? He's not the legit Lazarus in Catholicism. The real Saint Lazarus is the Bishop of Marseille, not the San Lázaro that we see from the parable of Lazarus and the rich man. And that's because of the Afro-Cuban community, right? And they're embracing that narrative. And I think you also just see it in the ways that popular religion, whether it's altars, whether it's the presence of food in Catholic altars, which you see that also is that influence on the island. I mean, it's a two-way street. In other words, one thing, and I probably did this early on as well, is we spent too much time thinking about how Catholicism influenced these Black Atlantic religions, and now we have to spend more time looking at how these religions actually are shaping Catholicism in the region.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that's incredible. And that's true. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that answer with us. And your thoughts on that. We're getting closer to, we're going to have a little bit of time for Q&A if anybody has any questions. But I have two more questions. One is that one of my favorite chapters in your book is the one on storytelling. And the different stories that you highlighted in Afro-Cuban history. But I would love to hear your thoughts on how you see the power of storytelling for different Afro-Latino, communities, and specifically in theology. How can storytelling be a tool that we use, specifically when it comes to, because I think I can speak for myself, but for a few friends, when we talk about this project, is this idea that we're kind of always in the middle of everyone. We're always, it's always a very nuanced conversation. We're in the in-between spaces because we're Black and we're Latino, and a lot of times Latino doesn't, translate to Black. So I would love to hear your thoughts on how the power of storytelling can change the way that we speak about theology.
I mean, for me, it really goes back to my background in theological aesthetics, and that for me, when we talk about theology, we're talking about the human response to an experience of the sacred, right? So we're not talking about, I don't do this anymore. When people would ask me what I would do when I'd sit next to them on planes, oh, I'm a theologian. And then, oh my God, then you're stuck sitting next to someone who's either way too religious or hates religion, and you're like trapped for 2 or 3 hours. But when I used to do that, people would say, well, you must know a lot about God. And I say, I know nothing about God. I don't know more about God than you do, but I do know about the human experience of the sacred, or at least the perceived, right? The human experience of their perception of an experience of the sacred. And everything that we do is a response, right? Whether it's a poem, whether it's, unfortunately, an academic theological text, whether it's a ritual, whether it's a painting, or whether it's a story. And so for me, storytelling is important, because I truly believe that entering into the particular of experience is how you capture and connect with a broader audience. Do you know what I mean? Like, talking about concrete experience and narratives and stories, it is not only how you engage people's minds, but you engage their hearts. And so for me, talking about justice means nothing. It's an abstraction, and so to me, storytelling is so powerful because of that. And also because, to me, our cuentos, they're our soul, they're our memory. Do you know what I mean? And I'm saying memory and not history, right? Because they can contain history in them, but more importantly, they're our memory, and when we transmit them, we're reaffirming that as part of our identity. And so for me, that's also why they're so powerful.
I love that, using our memory and not just history, because that's, I love writing and, kind of thinking on words and all of that. And so now I'm just sitting here like, oh, now I want to write about that.
No, that's great.
That. I'm going to be just sitting here journaling.
Sure.
So thank you for that.
No, you're welcome.
So I have one last question, and then we'll open it for Q&A. How can we center Blackness in Latinidad?
We just got to keep pushing. Do you know what I mean? Like, Ada Maria Estasi Diaz was my mentor and my close friend. And she said, la vida es la lucha. And that's not a bad thing. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's always having to center it. Do you know what I mean? Because the minute it's always having to be attentive to it. It has to be always centralizing that narrative, because ultimately we're never going to get to a place where, like, oh, it's good, we're done. We're living in a world. We live in a world that is constantly fighting against what we're trying to do. And I use the word fighting, not just not accepting. I mean, we live in a world, and I very much, I believe Ibram Kendi when he says that we can talk about progress and in terms of racial justice in this country, and we can equally talk about it deteriorating. And those two statements are not untrue, that we have forces that are working with us and more forces and allies more than ever. And we have justice, and we have more people working against us. And for me, that was like, when I, first read his book, that was an aha moment for me to kind of say, because again, we like categories, we like either or, like, oh, race, we're getting better or we're getting worse. We're getting better and worse. Right? Which means we always have to be on our toes, and it has to be, as Ada says, la lucha, the struggle, and to me, that's there's no end point to it, and I'm not being negative either. I'm just, I sort of really have accepted that has to define what we do, because the historical trajectory of this country has taught me. for example, the country that welcomed my parents as political refugees in 1960 with open arms no longer exists. And that's the very hard, thing to think about as I raised two teenage sons, right? That they would have a very different welcome today. And it wouldn't be a better one. But then there are other areas where we see huge, I don't want to use the word accomplishments, but we do see a stronger awareness of racism in other areas. So I mean, it's always that you're working for and against something always, and you sort of have to accept it. But I'm okay with that. Like, I don't think that's negative. I hope I'm not being like everyone's like, damn it, really, La Lucha all our lives, like, I mean, yeah, unfortunately, I think, yeah, La Lucha. Yeah. All the time. And I also think the last thing I would say is we have to call each other out. So I'm an administrator now. People call me out all the time. I mean, that's like my whole life, people telling me very clearly what I'm doing wrong. And not often telling me when I'm doing things right. And we as, which is fine, if they're not complaining, then I'm doing it right. But we as academics, especially like among, when you start getting to ourselves as Latinos, and we're a little too diplomatic with each other. Do you know what I mean? So I'm not saying to be rude or dismissive, but we have to challenge ourselves, and we have to challenge each other. Because if not, our voices will not grow.
Yeah, absolutely. That's as you mentioned, La vida es la lucha, and being in the struggle. I think I also think of, when I think of Blackness, I think of celebration and joy. And yeah. I think we forget that sometimes, like in the struggle, like there's always still so much celebration and joy, and that's like a very Black thing, and also just in general a very Latinx thing, Latino thing, to always have this sense of celebration in everyday life. And so yeah, so I agree with you. I don't think it's a negative thing to be in the struggle, because there is so much celebration even here today, right? Yeah. And it's not all anti-Blackness, and it's not all, racism, but it is the celebration of Blackness, and so, and I also think it's so interesting that because we wouldn't, like Latin America wouldn't be the Latin America that it is today without Blackness. And so in so many ways, we're always celebrating Blackness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's true.
Well, thank you so much for answering all my questions.
Oh, no problem.
We're gonna open it up for Q&A. Josue or Yolanda, would you like to jump on?
Yeah, I can jump on. We have one question that came up in the comments, and so I want to share that one. And as everybody else is comfortable, you can shoot your questions in the chat if you're not comfortable speaking them yourself, and we'll ask them to Dr. Maldonado. So we have a question here that says, oftentimes when Afro-Latinidad and religion are mentioned, people jump to Santeria, but there are many other religious expressions practiced by Afro-Latines. Has your research explored Afro-Latina people or just Latina people in general in things like Sephardic Judaism or Messianic Judaism? And then it says, thank you for this discussion at the end.
Oh, I have focused mostly, obviously, on Catholicism, and then La Regla del Cha, and a little bit on Palomonte and the Abacua, which are, all three are obviously Afro-Cuban religions. Now, had I not become an administrator, I probably would have done much more work on Espiritismo, because I'm sort of obsessed with it. And it's like, this whole spiritual, it's not a religion, but it's a spirituality that has deeply shaped not only Afro-Cuban religions, but but Catholicism, and you see it so prevalent in Cuba and in Brazil and in Puerto Rico. And so for me, I haven't really done, I, when I think about, for example, Judaism in Cuba, I always think of Ruth Behar's work and sort of like, check, she did all that, which is probably not always the easiest way out. But for me, I have kind of focused more on the Black Atlantic religions and Catholicism. But, Jelaine Schmidt has done some great research on Espiritismo. And I think that, to me, it's this very untapped area that I wish we would study a little bit more, because it seems to be something that touches multiple religious traditions.
Thank you, Dr. Maldonado. We have a question from Alexander. I don't know if you want to jump on and ask yourself.
Hi, good night. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
First of
we
all,
can see you now too.
excellent. Yeah, that's good to hear. Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for taking the time to present to us tonight. I've definitely learned some very valuable insights. But yeah, so like one positive aspect of Catholicism, was its impact on patronal festivals when, in the 15th and 16th century, when Spanish colonists, came to the Latin America and Caribbean countries like, the Dominican Republic or Cuba. These festivals are most often celebrated, in a town or region that bears the name of a saint, known as sort of like a patron saint. And the veneration of saints implies that these individuals who have a special closeness to God are enjoying eternal life. And this is a very important part of, I would say, Latin sort of Afro-Caribbean culture. But, there's various negative aspects as well that I think are rooted in today's culture. And I would just love to hear your opinion, perhaps maybe emphasize maybe that could be the Kabilo system, which sort of, was a divide and conquer strategy that sort of prevented widespread slave insurgency and, sort of promoted the use of racism. Do you think elements of that are still here today, perhaps through colorism or classism? Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's interesting when you look at the cabildos, and even if you look at in Central America, for example, the cofradías played a similar function, for example, in Central America. I feel like they backfired, and so what I mean by that is that they were really created to have this divide and conquer, right, structure, and really have, at least in Cuba, have slave populations remain identified by their ethnicity or their tribal nation, and therefore prevent them from organizing, right, in this broader collective. But what ended up happening is that they became such a key site for the survival of Black religion, right, and African religious traditions. So what began as something that was used to disempower and divide, and don't get me wrong, they were quite effective in that, at the same time actually became, I would argue, the most important structure for maintaining not only the religion, but the language of the different tribal nations.
That was very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, I wasn't sure if I...
Yeah, thank you so much. Have a great rest of your
night. No problem. Thank you, Alexander.
So we have two more questions, but before I ask those, I want to let y'all know that we will have a little trailer at the end of our documentary project that is going to come up, and we would love for you to stick around and see that as well. But yeah, let's get to those last two questions. So we have one that says, do you feel that in your work, it can be a catalyst for creating any space for amplifying healing connections between Afro-Latine, Afro-Caribbean, and African American people groups in our faith in the Afro diaspora?
Wow. I wish my work could do that. I think it's part of a bigger process. So of course, I think the things that we write and the things that we read and who we ourselves decide to read and who we decide to quote and cite in our work is very, very important. Do you know what I mean? So I think it's not only, okay, I have always thought of my work as part of a conversation, but I've also very intentionally inserted myself into conversations. Do you know what I mean? So whether it's, I mean, for me, really, before I went to the dark side of being an administrator. You know, for me, I really kind of characterized, you know, most of you know, the first 15 or so years of my academic career as really collaborating with Black and Latinx theologians. I mean, that's who I wanted to talk to. Those were the AAR panels I went to. That's where I wanted to present in CTSA. Those are the presentations I gave in Actus. And so for me too, you know, it's tough because we have to read each other and cite each other. I mean, that's so important. I get very frustrated, I'll be honest with you. And I've called folks out, Latinos and Latinas, that are like, oh, we want a dialogue with the Black community. And I'm like, but you've never cited a Black theologian in your work. Do you know what I mean? I'm like, what the hell? Like, give me a break. Like, enough with the Ronners and the, you know, and Ronner's great. You know, I'm at a Jesuit university now, so I can't, you know, everyone should be Ronner. No, but no, I'm like, dude, like, you know, like, cite people's work, like, read them. Don't just cite white theologians and Euro-American theologians and European theologians and tell me you want a dialogue, because I'm sorry, you're full of shit. So for me, it's a huge deal. You know, we can't just do these things without doing them. And so that really is something I became very early on committed to. And again, going back to credibility, because I didn't want to be someone who didn't know what I was talking about, you know, and just, you know, people are like, oh, Black theology. I'm like, Jim Cohn. I'm like, really? Like, a lot's happened since then. And, you know, Cohn was my mentor, you know, during my master's, someone that was very important to me. But, you know, there's been a lot of fantastic work done since his groundbreaking work. And so for me, that if I were going to say one of our biggest weaknesses, is that we claim to care about race, but we don't seem to reflect that in our scholarship.
Yes. And then our last question, and this, I'm curious to hear your answer to this one. It says, a question regarding ancestry and belonging. For those whose experience is mainly African-American, but they find out later in life that they have lineage from the Latinx culture, what are ways to acknowledge that our lived experience is specifically African-American while navigating a sense of connection / belonging to Afro-Latinx cultures and wanting to honor that ancestry as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, that's something I really struggle with, honestly, on a personal level. You know, I grew up obviously in a Cuban household. Spanish was my first language, and I had a very strong and continue to have a very strong sense of my Cuban identity. My husband is from Guatemala. He moved here after we got married. After we got married. You know, but he was already in his late 20s. And when I look at my sons, for example, my older son was born in Guatemala, and he identifies as Guatemalan. And I'm like, hello, Cuban too, you know, and he's like, you know, but we get into these debates because he's like, no, I'm Guatemalteco. I was born in Guatemala and I'm like Papa. And I'm like, you know, like, you're Guatemalan Cuban American. He's like, I can't even say that, you know, like, you know, that's like too long. And so, but whereas my younger son, who was born in Miami, I really strongly identifies as both. Do you know what I mean? So, and that's because he was raised in the US, right? With both sides of it. And I use that example to show that even in the same family, it shows how our identity is constructed. You know what I mean? So that even my two sons who have the same parents have very different sense of their Latinidad. And so to me, it's not, if we were both white Anglo missionaries and he was born in Guatemala, would he be less Guatemalteco? Do you know what I mean? Like it's so, you know, if he had just been born there and we left after 2 years and he never went back, he was still born in Guatemala. And so for me, it really shows how our identity is constructed. And to me, embracing your heritage and your identity, it is not something we should be calling each other out on, right? So like, I speak Spanish. People are like, ooh, you're a bougie Latina that speaks Spanish, because we know now so many of the younger generations, especially born in the States, don't speak Spanish, right? Are only English speaking, which I got to be honest with you, for me, I'm like, wow, like I so associate being being Cuban with speaking Spanish. But again, it shows how our identity is constructed. It shows how generations can impact. And I don't think embracing who you are, I think it has to come from a place of authenticity, though, and not appropriation. Do you know what I mean? So I lived in Guatemala for 2 years. My husband's Guatemalan. Apparently my older son is Guatemalan and not Cuban. I'm not like walking around in huipiles because of that. Do you know what I mean? And like dressing in indigenous dress because to me, that's something very connected to my identity. Right. And that has been culturally appropriated. But there are other ways that I've embraced, right? Like El Dia de los Muertos is something Cubans don't celebrate. Well, we celebrate that because we celebrate it in Guatemala. And I feel very moved and connected to El Dia de los Muertos in ways I never thought I would. I don't know if I would celebrate it if I didn't have a Guatemalan husband. Do you know what I mean? I'd feel like I was like, oh, I watched Coco and now I celebrate it. So I'm rambling now, but I guess my point is that I think it has to be where you're coming from and also sensitivity to how you're expressing it.
Thank you for your answer, Dr. Maldonado. And with that, we want to pass over to Charles or Josue. I don't know which one of the two is going to take it, but we want to present a trailer of our documentary project that is coming up, and then we will close out our time. I think it's Charles, the one that's going to speak right now. Yeah.
Hey, everyone. I'm just going to really quickly, by the way, Dr. Maldonado, I loved this talk so much.
Thank you.
I was so drawn in the whole time. There was a moment where you were discussing stories and like the power of stories. And like I'm a storyteller. And so like I think the most moving moments, while I love academic papers are beautiful, the most moving things for me, because I think we're really feeling creatures, are always like the stories that people tell. And they're always like, this is my experience. This is the complexity and the whole of my experience that isn't always like super categorized and super easily pieced together, which was another thing you mentioned. I just wanted to be like, I loved everything you said. So
thank you.
Of course. I'm just introducing really quickly the trailer for the short documentary Faith and Blackness, which is just an exploration of Afro-Latina stories of faith and belief, and they're just individual stories. And initially, it was just in response to this paper that Josue had written, which talked about like the tenets of Afro-Latina theology being dynamic and the decentralization of power and ancestral remembrance, social justice, the embodiment and communal liberation. They were like all these points were like Afro-Latinos feel these things in their faith. And I was like, I'm not sure how that looks like, but I'd love to talk to a bunch of those folks and see how those things are. And so we just started interviewing so many people, people who had different beliefs and different faiths and different understandings of the world around them. But the one connective tissue was that they were all Afro-Latinx. And so we asked them, how does one connect to the other? How does your faith speak to your experience as an Afro-Latino or Afro-Latina? And the stories were beautiful. And so we're looking to piece them together and just tell the stories of these people. We don't have any point to make with them. We think that when people hear the stories, like people will decide what they feel and what they think, because they're all powerful stories in and of themselves. So we just want to introduce the trailer to Faith and Blackness.
Religion is something that is man-made, is a framework, but faith is a relationship. You know, it's something that is personal.
What was, I think, missing and is still missing to this day is an emphasis on how our ethnic identity, in our case being Afrodescendientes, is very much an integral part of our spirituality.
I understood myself to be Afro-Latina in college, but I think I understood myself to be Black from, you know, forever.
My image of God is steeped in Blackness.
When the highest thing that you have in your concept, the divine, is Black, then you know that that part of that's within you that's Black is also worthy of that exaltation.
If we're going to continue a solely Europeanized spirituality and not really decolonize aspects of our spirituality, it won't fit the congregation.
And so I want to live a religious Catholic experience that's decolonized, that's like affirming, that's you know, tolerant and loving and humble, because those are all the things that Christ was.
Afro-Latinidad in regards to spirituality is like eating mofongo. It's like eating totones. It's like eating grains. I mean, it's part of me.
It's all Black. It's all Black. It's Black gods. It's Black religions. They're having a Black concept of God Almighty.
Blackness is not just this reference point to whiteness or Europeanness, that it stands on its own within the ecology of beauty and grace.
And yeah, we're so excited about this documentary. We're excited about this work that's going to come out hopefully within the next month. And with that, we want to remind you to stay connected to us throughout our webpage, www.afrolatinetheology.com, or our Instagram at Afro-Latina-Theology, and Facebook the same. I saw a question in the comments asking if the event was recorded. It was, so a video or an edited version of it should be coming out soon for you to share. I think the trailer is available on YouTube, or will be available on YouTube in the next coming days, so you will be able to probably share that as well. We want to thank you for coming. We want to thank Karla for directing the conversation. We want to thank Dr. Michelle Maldonado for joining us and being with us for this event. Like we said, this is the first of a series of 4 events, so our next one will be during Black History Month in February. So stay connected with us, send us your questions, share, you know, tag, all of that stuff. And again, thank you so much for joining us tonight and for being part of this conversation. We send you abrazos, besos, and well wishes for the weekend, and y'all have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Gracias.
Si Dios fuera negro, mi compay, todo cambiaría. Fuera nuestra raza, mi compay, la que mandaría.
Negro el presidente y el gobernador, negro el abogado y negro el doctor, compay.
Si Dios fuera negro, mi compay, todo cambiaría. Fuera nuestra raza, mi compay, la que mandaría.
Negra la azucena y negra la tiza, negra Blanca Nieve, negra Mona Lisa, compay.
Si Dios fuera negro, mi compay, todo cambiaría.